Okay, I'll use the mic. Yeah, and so he told the story. He finally got all the nephews together when he turned age 80, and the story was that when the dive bombers would dive at Midway and Guadalcanal and all, he would yell. They'd all yell. Yelling was what they did to stay alive. Then he came home, did the bond tour, and he came back. And of course, by that time, they had the G suit because it'd be late 44 and early 45. And the G suit and the mask made such a huge difference in the M1 maneuver, the M1, M meaning Mayo 1, developed by Andy's dad. So that's where I come through on this. I'm just going to go through a few slides. I'm going to point out just a few things. First of all, why did Mayo get involved in this thing? Well, Mayo got involved. It had a strong culture of respect for the military. William Worrell Mayo, the dad of the Mayo brothers, was in Le Sueur, Minnesota. He ran over to New Ulm when they had the Battle of New Ulm during the Dakota War, and then subsequently became the examining surgeon for the Minnesota Volunteer Army when that recruitment depot moved over to Rochester, which is how Mayo Clinic got to Rochester instead of Le Sueur. And then of course, they got very involved. Will and Charlie, the brothers, got very involved. They actually were some of the founders of the U.S. Army Medical Reserve Corps, which is at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania now. And for a period of time, Renee can tell you exactly what that time was. Renee Zimmer is here, and she can tell you, but basically the brothers would take turns going to Washington, D.C. to form that Medical Reserve Corps and do a variety of other things in Washington. For a long period of time, they eventually became brigadier generals. They inspired their son. Mayo, by the way, during World War I, had military base 26 on the River Somme in France. The Mayo brothers paid out of their own personal expenses for one third of all the employees of Mayo Clinic to be involved in the military during World War I. Their Charlie's son, Chuck Mayo, was very involved in World War II and led the 71st General Hospital in New Guinea. And so Mayo's had a long set of involvement in the military and a general patriotism. And if you go to the bells up on top of the Plumber Building, they're dedicated to the American soldier. It's engraved in the bells. So that's a pretty neat thing. But why Mayo? Specifically, they look at Aero medicine. Well, in 1939, it was a leader in oxygen research and clinical applications of oxygen therapy for medical purposes, not for aero purposes at the time. It was one of only 5 aeromedical labs in the entire U.S. So Harvard had one, Mayo had one, and then there were 3 military bases. What's now Wright-Patterson Airfield in Dayton, Pensacola had the Navy one, and the Army Air Corps also had one down in San Antonio. Randy Lovelace was involved, and he'd gotten drafted, and he became an officer and assigned to Wright-Patterson Airfield in Dayton in 1937, and then they had him do a tour of Germany to study German aviation science, and he was really struck by how advanced their science and aeromedical field was. He had a good relationship with a guy named Dr. Hubertus Strughold, who really became kind of the father of space medicine here in the United States. And Dr. Strughold, as did a lot of the German physicians involved in aeromedical science, also had some potential issues, and many of them went on trial at Nuremberg. Some of them were sentenced to long-term prison sentences. High-altitude parachute jumps by concentration camp prisoners who were pushed out of the plane. Studied, they had all kind of other human experimentation issues. So a lot of those things had to be vetted after the war as we tried to learn what they knew, and we tried to get their scientists here before the Russians could get them. So Strughold happened to be one of those. Randy Lovelace reports on this advance to the Army. The Army says, hey, can we get Mayo's help? Because Randy Lovelace represented Mayo. So the main concerns, as they pointed out in the contract, is basically high altitude issues, hypoxia, cold, and decompression. So the bends like you get when you scuba dive and you come up too fast, well, this is going up and down too fast. Acceleration issues with a G-induced force loss of consciousness, or G-LOC, which you can see in the Top Gun movies, right? They talk about G-LOC in the Top Gun movies. The aeromedical unit, the primary outcomes of the high altitude lab, basically, they did the Boothby, Lovelace, Bulbulian mass. And by the way, the daughter of Dr. Bulbulian lives, Paul Scanlon here took me up by her house. She lives in her dad's old house up here, not far from Bailey Heights, are still going strong, and she's still going strong. And this mask worked not only for civilians, where they have an open mouth that you could eat and drink while you're flying, across country, but also the military then, where you could put a microphone in there. They were comfortable for civilians. They could do all these other things. In the military, they had that microphone, had quick connects to oxygen resources, a lot of really nice things. But more importantly, they were able to design so that the water would not form ice. It would disappear before it formed ice. And that was really important. And then the acceleration laboratory, where Andy's dad worked, refinement of the pressure suit. We didn't invent the G suit here, but we refined it. And that's what Dr. Wood did, and his colleagues refined it and really made one that could actually be used in practical purposes. And they tried many, many, many variations, as they said there. And my son today wears a G suit very similar to that. My son today wears a mask very similar to the one that the Bulbulians had. So, and then, as we're going to see in just a minute, an incredible thing that Andy Wood brought tonight is the original pulse oximeter, and he's going to tell us about it. He's got it with him. It's unbelievable. In anesthesia, we live and die with a pulse oximeter. I'm just so impressed that Andy brought that tonight. Thank you, Andy. And then they also had to educate. You can't just develop stuff. You have to educate them. They had people coming in all the time. We had a big military base out here over by where Mayo High School is now. And they'd educate these pilots. They put them in decompression chambers. They do all types of things. They'd even put them in the centrifuge. And really, there was a guy named Strom, Dr. Strom, who developed a lot of the remote monitoring. So we talk about Apple Watches and remote monitoring. Well, he's the guy that started this whole remote monitoring thing. Pretty remarkable outcomes. And here's the best quote to summarize what this whole aeromedical unit did. Wilhelm Messerschmitt. So Messerschmitt, the plane that the Germans flew, that was an incredible plane. It outperformed all of our planes. But the pilots didn't outperform all of the planes because they did not have a G suit. He said, we had nothing to match the G suit, and I knew immediately that if American aviation science was so far ahead of us to make such a suit, Germany had lost the war already. That's pretty impressive to think he said that. So we're just going to talk real briefly some of the highlights of some of the key people. Walter Boothby. So Boothby, Lovelace, Bulbulian mask, the first B, was an anesthesiologist, I'm kind of proud to say, from Peterbilt Brigham Hospital and in Boston. He was the anesthesiologist for Harvey Cushing. Now, some of the folks out here may know Harvey Cushing, who became the father of neurosurgery. He studied in Oxford, England, in the lab of J.D. Haldane. And if you happen to know a lot about gases, Haldane, all Haldane's things were really incredible as you calculate concentrations and mixed pressure variations and all in gas. So, impressed the heck out of me. Now, I don't know about you folks, but impressed me. He joined Mayo in 1960 and was head of metabolism. So he was really into how do you figure out from the gases you breathe in and out, what was it you ate and how well did it get digested and how many calories did it produce. He served in U.S. Expeditionary Force in World War I as chief of gas defense. Makes sense, an anesthesiologist would be involved in gas, particularly in this case, gas that you breathe, not gas that comes out the other way. He served as inaugural chair of Mayo's aeromedical unit, and then, as it said here, he was recipient of one of the big awards on behalf of the entire aeromedical unit. Randy Lovelace. Now, this was really kind of fun. He was a surgeon, joined Mayo in 1934. His primary assignment was to provide oxygen to patients better than we were. They used to have these oxygen tents. You see some of these old movies where people are in tents, and it wasn't very easy to take care of the patient inside these tents. So he developed the mask originally to deliver oxygen to patients instead of being inside of an oxygen tent. Made nursing care a lot easier. So he joined the Air Corps. He was actually drafted in 1937, And then Charlie Mayo was asked by Northwest Airlines, 1937, to study all the issues related to high altitude flying. And he turned to Randy Lovelace and said, okay, Randy, this is your job. And that's where they developed that first mask where you could eat and drink and do all that. And then he got Distinguished Flying Cross for jumping out of that plane. 40,000 feet, jumping out of the plane is pretty cold. You know, it's about minus 55 degrees usually when you jump out from there. And he lost those fingers, was never able to operate again. For some of the people in the audience, you've heard of the Lovelace Clinic. There's the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, the Leahy Clinic in Boston. There's the Lovelace Clinic out in Albuquerque. And so Randy Lovelace's uncle formed that. And then after the war, Randy Lovelace went out there, became an administrator and a researcher because he couldn't use his hands to operate. And eventually then became the director of NASA's space program. I think that's pretty cool. Other names you might know, some of you folks may have heard the name Fred Helmholtz, an incredible pulmonary researcher, became the father of respiratory care. So he really invented the whole field of respiratory care. Charles Lindbergh, they talked about already, and I've got a couple of questions, kind of a potpourri of questions here at the end about him. Art Babolian, who I mentioned, the daughter, lives right up here on the hill. A dentist, did a lot of facial prosthetics. People like Dr. Kerry Olsen here would do surgery, remove part of the jaw for cancer. He would put the prosthesis together that the surgeons could then put in and reassemble a face. An amazing guy. He also then became the director of Mayo's Medical Museum, where the Gonda building sits. Remember the old museum? Terrific museum, by the way. When every kid that ever saw it, what did they remember? The board that had all the things they pulled out of stomachs that kids ate. Remember that? That was pretty cool. But, and that was his idea to do that. Ed Baldus, E.J. Baldus, developed the centrifuge with George Hallenbach in the basement of the Franklin heating station. So downtown, really on the corner of, that'd be 3rd Street Southwest and 2nd Avenue Southwest, the Franklin heating station there with the big smokestack. In the basement, that's where they did this. And it became the test model that eventually gave the new big centrifuge that Andy's got a few pieces of here. And anyhow, received all kind of awards for what he did. Charles Code, again, Paul Scanlon, who knows everything about Rochester and has written 2 books on the history of Rochester, took me around on a tour today and showed me where Charles Code lived. Not terribly far from a whole bunch of people that people from Mayo would know. Anyhow, he became pretty important. He was a mentor to Earl Wood at the University of Minnesota and then vigorously recruited him to come back. And was recipient of the American Association of Science, the Smith Award, for studying histamine's role in allergic reactions. Anybody ever have an allergy and have to take Benadryl? Well, it was his work that led to the idea that histamine was part of that allergic reaction, led to the whole development of antihistamines and the antihistamines you take to prevent peptic ulcer disease, like cimetidine, Tagamet, ranitidine, I forget what the name of it is, Zantac. That was all his work that led to that. He became the father of gastrointestinal motility, president of the American Gastroenterological Association, member of the Board of Governors, and he was a leading advocate for the development of the Mayo Medical School, and we've got several graduates of that school in this audience tonight. Earl Wood, so this is Andy's dad. They called him the coach. And from Mankato, he's an outstanding student athlete at McAllister College. He developed that M1 anti-gravity straining maneuver in 1942. Just like his son Andy, he was a big, strong guy, and okay, I'm giving you that, Andy. And had the musculature to make that happen. Partnered with Dave Clark to refine the pressure suit for pilots. They tested suits from other companies too. They just didn't pick one. They had other companies they tested the suits on, but working very closely with Dave Clark and Munsingware up here in the Twin Cities. It turns out Dave Clark had actually developed a stitch for elastic used in girdles. You slide in them, they'd be tight and pull tight. And he leased that then to Munsingware, leased the Patton, it's Munsingware, became close friends of him, and Munsingware helped him build this G suit. But more importantly, probably more importantly, they had those big flywheels they used for the centrifuge. They came from Western Hills, which is a western suburb of Cincinnati, and an old pump station. They brought it up here, but they couldn't figure out how to get the thing turning without, you had to have a rubber tire, and you couldn't get rubber. But Munsingware was a good friend of the mayor of Minneapolis. I think Andy was how it was, and anyhow, they were able to get a tire and bring it down. That tire was the only tire they ever used, I think. Pretty amazing.
No, they went through several.
Oh, they went through several. Okay, thank you. Okay, anyhow, they got the Clark type that was used in combat in 1944 and really turned the tide of the war, in the air war at least. More on our world, just because he's such a remarkable guy. 65-year plus research and clinical care career. He was a physician as well as a PhD, and he did a lot of the early work in developing the field of cardiac catheterization. Not the first place it was ever done, but he refined it, brought tools to it that had never been done before, and allowed people like Jeremy Swan, some of the people in the audience will have heard of a pulmonary artery catheter called the Swan-Ganz catheter. He developed that with Jeremy Swan. John Kirkland, who was a famous cardiac surgeon, and a variety of others, developed with Earl Wood the heart-lung bypass machine that became the most popular and most successful in the United States. With Dr. Jess Edwards, developed the catheterization that defined really many congenital heart defects. With Dr. Irwin Fox, developed a dilution technique that diagnosed cardiac issues, which still used today. Very interesting how it worked. And then he developed the pulse oximeter we're going to see. He created a thing called dynamic spatial reconstructor. It's where the centrifuge used to be in the medical science building. And I got to do my research grant that I was involved with, had to use that dynamic spatial reconstructor. I think we were the last study ever done on it. Yeah, I think we either broke the machine or it was the last time. But it led to the development really of CT scanners and fast CT scanners. The whole concept was tested in terms of a dynamic spatial reconstructor. And he had a lot of great research fellows, and that's why they called him the coach. But one of them is Eric Rittman, Dr. Eric Rittman, who I don't think he's here tonight, but Eric's one of our members. Matter of fact, Eric and his wife.
You couldn't show up.
Well, okay, yeah. Eric and his wife actually sponsor or support a lot of bringing school kids from Rochester area out here. They help pay for the buses, and their support pays for that. So really terrific. And then there are other people. Dr. Hugh Smith, you might know, led Mayo Clinic here in Rochester for quite a while. Dan Connolly, Bill Mangan, names you might know from around the area. David Clark came from Worcester, Massachusetts. That stitch about the elastic for girdles and undergarments. And he volunteered to work here. He wanted to come work here. He thought, I have something that might work and help. He went to Wright-Patterson, or Wright. I grew up only 20 miles from Wright-Patterson. It's Wright Field, but now it's Wright-Patterson. Anyhow, when he first came up here, the first suit they designed, he put a real football bladder. They took an old football, cut off the cover, and put the football bladder in there. They've refined it since then. And so that was pretty cool. And the Dave Clark Company now is the world leader in producing aviation headsets. I use a Dave Clark headset, as does my wife, Mary Ellen. And other electronics, the NASA spacesuits. The people that are up there right now are wearing Dave Clark spacesuits, and they developed a bunch of other stuff. Ed Lambert, you saw Ed Lambert trying to scramble like he was in a fighter bomber going down, and remember he was scrambling along the wall trying to figure out how to put a parachute on and off. Recruited to Mayo as a research fellow. He had two primary assignments: develop techniques to escape bombers that were shot down. But he ended up spending more time than anybody, I think, other than maybe Earl Wood, in the centrifuge, and then address concerns about lab finding that occur in the real fight, trying to get out of a plane. He built the first EMG machine. You saw that in use there in 1947, and he is the father of electromyography. I mean, and when I don't just throw these terms out. Being the father of a specialty field of medicine is a pretty big deal. So this is pretty neat. And then with Lee Eaton of Mayo, described the Lambert-Eaton syndrome, myasthenic syndrome that some of us during med school have to learn about. And then with his wife, Anna London, defined the etiology of myasthenia gravis. And it's a pretty common disease anymore. Potpourri. Just a couple quick potpourri. They're kind of fun to think about. Earl Wood and Dave Clark independently saw the movie Dive Bomber in 1942. Earl Wood saw it. I don't know if he was here. No, he was in Boston. He was in Boston at the time. Or maybe Pennsylvania. I don't know, one of the two.
No, he was in Boston.
He was in Boston at the time. And Dave Clark was in Worcester. But both of them independently became very intrigued about this whole loss of consciousness thing, because that was the main theme of the thing, how fighter pilots would lose consciousness and all. And it starred Errol Flynn, Fred McMurray, remember My Three Sons? Yeah. And Ralph Bellamy. I mean, it had some great stars, produced at the request of the Navy. The Navy couldn't recruit pilots fast enough. Kind of like Top Gun, when Top Gun came out. My kid's a pilot because of Top Gun. He wanted to be like Maverick. And same thing here. People wanted to be like Fred McMurray, because Fred's the star who dies in the crash in the end from loss of consciousness. So made at the request of the Navy, and it dramatically increased the number of recruits they had. Produced by Warner Brothers, it featured scenes on the USS Enterprise. That's the ship my uncle flew off of. He also flew off the Hornet in Battle of Midway, had to jump off of it when it was sunk, and survived. Showcased the Douglas TBD Devastator, was a dive bomber, which wasn't a very good one, and the SBD, which was a newer Dauntless dive bomber. And it was maybe SBD by means slow but deadly. And it was very slow. They get shot down pretty often, but they were really good at putting their bombs on their target, whereas none of the other bombers were. And the movie led to a dramatic increase in these applicants. Potpourri number 2. The first aviator pressure suit was used by Wiley Post. Wiley Post was a famous pilot. Matter of fact, for a period of time, Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, and Wiley Post were the 3 best known pilots in the world. He flew around the world not just once, but twice. He went with a partner the first time and set the world record. First general aviation plane to go around the world. And then number 2, went by himself. Did the same thing, set a bunch of speed records. He enticed Will Rogers to go fly to Alaska and Russia, and they died on takeoff from Point Barrow, Alaska, and it's one of the most famous aircraft crashes, other than maybe Amelia Earhart, who disappeared somewhere in the Pacific. Just last week, I see they think it's in the Torara Atoll this time. I don't know, but we'll find out. Charles Lindbergh, though, lived quite a while. He lived till 1972. Potpourri number 3, the Gee Whiz. That's the SBD dive bomber, same one my uncle used, loaned to Mayo. Flew more than 100 missions over Rochester to test that G-suit and M1 maneuvers. Earl Wood once had the pilot, Ken Bailey. We saw him blowing up his G-suit there as he got in the plane. He flew over, really be Andy's grandparents' house. Lake Washington is just about 5 miles northeast of the Mankato airport. And they had a kind of a resort, and then eventually turned the family home. And flew over just to show off in front of Earl's parents. That was pretty cool. Randy Lovelace, promoted to colonel, got the Distinguished Flying Cross for jumping out of that crazy plane. Anyhow, the very cool thing was he became the NASA Director of Space Medicine, but unfortunately, just a year later, tragically died in a private plane crash in Colorado with his wife. Really sad. And this might be the last one, Charles Lindbergh, previously known, of course, for that solo flight from New York to Paris in 1927. Also known for his 1932 kidnapping and murder of his infant son, the crime of the century, which led to a number of houses, including some in Rochester, having tunnels built out of them. So if anybody came to kidnap your family or you or whatever, you could go out the secret tunnels out the back. I think Plummer House has an escape tunnel, don't they? I believe that's true. Hysteria over the crime led him to move his family to Europe in 1935 to 39, which is where he really got to know the Germans and became a little bit of an advocate, not only for neutrality, but some people believe for the Nazis, and whether that's true or not, it's a little unclear. He did get refused a commission to the Air Corps or the Navy because Roosevelt believed he was advocating for the Nazis, and he never let him join the military during the entire war. But oddly enough, he became a consultant for Boeing and Douglas and other airplane companies. He ended up going out to the Pacific and becoming a consultant who happened to fly with fighter planes, and somehow ended up flying solo in some of those and is credited shooting down an enemy plane as a civilian. I think the only civilian to shoot down an enemy plane in World War II. And then it turns out President Eisenhower liked that, so he did reinstall him in the military and made him a brigadier general. And here he volunteered, and then you heard about Lucy Cronin saving his life. So it would have been kind of a bad thing to have Charles Lindbergh die in your chamber. So in summary, the unit produced remarkable outcomes. The G suit, the M1 maneuver, which was Andy's dad, and the G suit, the Boothby, Loveless, Flamboyant mask, cardiac catheterization came from that, and that was Earl Wood. The dye dilution techniques were Earl Wood and Irwin Fox. Pulse oximetry, and we're going to see the original one here in just a little bit. Very cool. Wasn't the first time pulse oximetry was ever used, but the first time it was made where it could practically be used because of Earl's background in physiology. Improvements in aircraft design that reduce the risk of high altitude flight, and respiratory therapy. And that's all I have. And a pretty remarkable group of people. Andy, could you do your show and tell? I'm going to turn on the lights over there.
Sure, hang on.
It's just amazing he brought this. I didn't ask him to. It's fantastic. And is Krista here?
No.
She's around here someplace.
Krista is in the back there, yeah. And Krista, by the way, her dad was very involved in the Nuremberg trials. And recently, Krista, who's incredibly patient but also persistent, we got the National World War II Museum out of New Orleans to come up, interview her dad and a few other still living veterans up here just recently. So Krista, thank you for all you've done too. Andy, you're up, and we got the lights on.
Okay.
Want me to hold something while you're doing that?
Oh,
So you don't drop
I
it?
can hang on
Okay.
here for a second. I
I
don't
don't want you
have.
to, I don't want you to drop that.
No, I won't. If I drop
Not
it,
the mic,
it'll
that's
hurt.
the other thing I'm worried about.
I don't have a prepared presentation at all, but I do have a couple of things I can show you. I do have a couple remaining parts of the centrifuge which I can pass around. What I have in my hand here are two bearings that came off of the centrifuge once it was dismantled. All right, so you can imagine there were two 20-ton flywheels resting on these bearings. Okay, so I can just kind of make sure I get them back. All right, these are family heirlooms. They're a piece of not only Mayo Clinic history, but personal history. But you'll get an idea when you feel how heavy these things are, you know. The other thing is the centrifuge was dormant for about 5 years. So if you can imagine 40,000, or not 40,000, but 40 tons resting on these bearings, and they were never marked up. Wow. So I'll just pass these around. The other thing I've got is the original pulse oximeter. Now the way this was discovered is, if you saw on the movie, there was an infrared sensor on the subject's ear, okay, and it was originally developed to just to measure pulse. And they were using these infrared sensors when they first started doing catheterization. By the way, you know who did the first catheterization at Mayo?
Your dad, I think.
No.
No?
No.
Who?
Howard Burchell
Howard?
and an anesthesiologist,
Yes,
Dr. Pender.
John Pender,
Yep.
who died not too long ago.
Yep. He did the first cardiac catheterization, and they ended up assigning it to my dad. Anyway, when they started doing cardiac catheterizations, they had this infrared sensor on the ear, and when they would flush the catheter, okay, they had to flush the catheter to prevent a clot happening at the end of the catheter. They noticed that the opacity on the readout of the infrared sensor changed. And they got to thinking, you know, I wonder if this has something to do with the opacity of the blood and the amount of oxygen that's in the blood. And so what they did is they did a series of experiments with people breathing different concentrations of oxygen, take the blood out, and then look at the opacity of the blood. And what they came up with is oximetry. It was the original pulse oximetry. And actually, I was going to keep that in there because those wires are so fragile.
We need an archivist.
So what's in there is not only the original pulse oximeter, but also the calibration slides. They had to calibrate it every time they did a cardiac catheterization. So Chris, if you can just, yeah, she's getting there. So while she's working on that, I'll open it up to questions. And by the way, I want to say this was a very great presentation. Historically very accurate.
It's so great. Do you know the first time that was used in town here?
It had to
Or the
be
year?
probably about 1948, because the first catheterization done was in 47. And by the way, this is manufactured in Rochester by the Waters Conley Corporation.
Candy, let me ask, was that
Why
also
don't you
used
hold
on the,
this up
was
for
that
me?
also used on the ear, by the way?
Yes.
So would it have been in 1943 when they started doing
Well,
that?
no,
'Cause
no,
there's some
not
pictures of it.
oximetry, but they
They were just doing pulse.
They were just measuring pulse.
Okay, so
in the
47 or
40s.
48.
So I'll just get this out. So anyway, this thing would clip on the ear, about right there.
So the ear is the original spot.
What's that?
The ear is the original spot.
Yeah.
The ear is
The
the
finger
original
is in all
spot. It was
places.
not on the finger.
Yeah.
Took a guy named Bob Newell to actually take that in about 1968, 69
So,
and come up with a finger
yeah.
one that was,
And if you see, if you take
Reliable
this
enough?
out, it's got a little different opacity. You can sort of see through it, but that's what they would slide in here to calibrate it. And it had a known opacity to it. So, I'll just let Chris carry that around.
Yeah,
But
that's
that
pretty
is-
remarkable.
It's in its original case.
and that pulse oximeter, by the way, the one you're familiar with now, was developed about 68, 69, but it was really about 85 when it got introduced into practice. And then, as Marion will tell you, it was a lot of abnormal beats. You didn't know what the heck was going on about a third of the time. So, but by 88 though, it was good enough you could put it on a rock and you could see what was going on. It really got refined in the 80s.
Again, can you remind us, when did Dr. Lubbock got, you said you got drafted back in,
Well, I either drafted or volunteered. It's been a little
I
unclear, and
thought you
I've seen two
volunteered.
ways. Yeah, I've seen it two different ways.
Volunteer.
Yeah.
Right.
because I just did your research, the first, peacetime draft wasn't until, in between World War I and World War II, wasn't until 1940.
Okay.
It's probably true.
He may have
I bet
volunteered,
he
because I've
volunteered.
seen in different books, it'll say drafted. And actually, one of the Mayo movies, an older movie, says he was drafted. But I think you're probably right, as I saw that, and the same thing.
He
Probably volunteered.
He was a very enthusiastic individual, and knowing him, I bet he
Yeah.
volunteered.
And a pilot. He was
Yeah.
a pilot. And evidently pretty good until 1965. Sadly.
As I understand, we had pilots here for research and pilots for testing and pilots for training. Can you give us any numbers on those?
Ooh, Lee might. Lee, are you here? Lee was here. Oh, that's too bad. Lee knows more about Rochester Airport than anybody I ever know. I honestly cannot tell you. I wish I could, but
It was a lot.
it was a lot. Yeah, a lot of some of the gliders that landed in D-Day, the pilots were trained here. And then this was also an important base because the P-40 was built in near Buffalo, and it was used primarily by the Russian army in Leningrad. And they would fly it from Buffalo, and these were women pilots that flew these. These are the WACs. Would fly from Buffalo to Rochester. We even had a Quonset hut for women out here in the Homestead Village area. And they would stay overnight, and then they'd fly from here, I think, to Montana next. And then eventually from Montana up to Fairbanks, and then from Fairbanks across the Bering Strait, and eventually Leningrad. They never lost a plane or a female pilot. Just unbelievable how good those women were at flying. But so there are a lot of planes flying through here all the time. Ken Bailey, the pilot of the SBD dive bomber for the test, one of his main jobs was to make sure the women were adequately supplied and everything was running smoothly.
Well, I find it kind of interesting, and you said something that conflicted with, I had heard that the American women flew the planes to Fairbanks and turned them over to
Yeah, then the Russian women would take them on over.
Okay, so the American women.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, American women got out in Fairbanks, gave the planes to the Russian women who flew them on to Leningrad.
All right.
But none of the Russian women were lost and no plane was lost, which is amazing when you think about it.
I have kind of a general question. Art Donahue from nearby St. Charles, summer of 1940, goes to England, joins the Royal Air Force, flies Spitfires. He was actually shot down, but in March of 41, he was able to come home on leave. It was either in one of his books or it was in a newspaper account of the time. He visited the Mayo Clinic. And I'm just wondering if in your research his name appears and what feedback or what input he might have had.
Boy, I don't have any record.
I think
of
it's
that.
in your book.
No,
It's not?
no, I don't know.
It's in one of the books I read
Yeah.
recently. But yes, he did
I
come and he
wouldn't be
gave a lot of ideas.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but the aeromedical unit wasn't formed yet by 1941.
I'm sorry?
That's
It was,
true.
it was 42 when the unit was formed, but there were people here already interested in testing the model centrifuge
Yeah.
and doing all that.
Yeah, that was, by the way.
Yeah, he was a heck of a pilot.
That was the WASP, the Women Air Force Service pilots who carried those planes.
WASP, not
Yeah,
wax,
In fact,
WASP.
in 2 weeks,
Thank
they're
you.
having their reunion down at Sweetwater, Texas.
Ah.
I don't know if there are any WASP still surviving, but,
He'd be pretty old.
Yeah.
He'd be about 100.
Question back there.
During all of this research, was there any research done on hypoxic symptoms? And if there was, any findings, was that disseminated to pilots in World War II?
Well, were there symptoms? Yeah, so the educational program they went through, they put them into pressure chambers, decompressed them, and they then had to take their masks off, just like pilots do now, and they get in there and they start riding at certain elevations. So in civilian aircraft, you can fly at 12,500 feet with no oxygen, and that's been pretty well tested. But you can go to 13,000 for 30 minutes, but then legally at that point you have to be putting oxygen on to supplement what you're doing. And nowadays everybody uses a pulse oximeter. My wife and I use pulse oximeters when we fly higher. But then you go up, 18,000 feet, you're toast. But they make them, as they ascend, or the pressure gets lower and lower, they make them write different things. They'll talk into the compressor chamber and tell them to write things, and then you just see their handwriting falls apart, and they cannot do it. So they teach them about hypoxia, they make them take off their mask, and they decompress them. So they get all, during World War II, all the pilots trained here, but also pilots came from everywhere else to learn to do this here. In the United States military now, in the Navy, Marines, and Air Force, they do the exactly same thing. Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo does the Air Force, Pensacola does the Navy. I think the Marines also use the Navy base in Pensacola for that.